What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the DTC Exits Pod. This is your host, Adonis Ayeva, and I'm excited to present this show because we'll be covering different exits from historic deals to actual current deals. And we'll also talk to e-commerce founders that have exited their brands and also acquisition entrepreneurs that have acquired e-commerce brands. So very excited. And once again, welcome, and I'll talk to you soon. Reginald Lewis. But today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into a specific deal that was really his first successful deal and may have really been his best work. Even though it may not be what he's most famous for, it may really have been his best work. And so Reggie was able to eventually control a $1 billion company, Beatrice Foods, and that's really what he was most known for. But before that, there's a company called McCall Pattern company that he acquired in 1983, and this is arguably his best work, and we'll get a little bit deeper into why. But essentially, today we'll cover what led up to him actually acquiring the McCall Pattern company and how he was able to scale it, lead it to its best years in terms of profitability, and then sell it for a 90x return, right? And so it's crazy that, he was able to do this as a Harvard-educated lawyer. His day job was actually being an attorney, right? And being also a black guy that had not done any deals really that were significant prior to McCall, he faced a lot of issues, even being able to close deals, not necessarily because of capital, because he was able to raise capital, right? But because he was a young black man and, he hadn't done any deals, really, people on Wall Street didn't really know him, right? And so he faced a lot of challenges early on, like being able to just have that credibility. And it's crazy, looking back that this was in the 80s. This was in the 80s that he was really doing corporate buyouts, right? And one of the things that stuck with me when I listened to the audiobook of his autobiography, Why So White Guys Have All the Fun, was really on the heels of the McCall Pattern deal. He was talking to one of his young lawyers at his practice, and he was saying, I wonder why more black men are not actually acquiring established companies, right? I wonder why everyone is so stuck on starting something from scratch, right, when you could be buying these companies. I mean, he was closing deals as an attorney, right, years before he even started closing deals for himself. So he would see all these deals being closed, all these companies being acquired, and he was actually diving deep into, what made these transactions work, what made some companies so profitable, why were some executives so successful. And so it really led to him saying, why not just acquire one of these companies, right? And so it's crazy that 40 years later, there's still not that many people acquiring companies compared to people that are starting companies from scratch, right? And so I think that's why it's so important to study history. I've always loved history, to be honest. It was probably my favorite subject actually back in school. And I think that, studying things like this, it really helps. And I'm grateful that I was able to do this podcast and get to study Reginald Lewis again, because it really even helped me. It gave me some ideas as to, some of the deals that I'm currently looking at and just my overall strategy as I, continue to acquire more companies. But before this great McCall Pattern company, we've got to talk about his first deal that he actually attempted to acquire. This was a company called Park Sausage in Baltimore. So this was 1975. The owner was actually retiring, right? So he was sick and he was looking to retire. Although this was a publicly traded company, it was controlled by just the founder and one of his partners. So Reggie Lewis offered $3 million, which was a premium compared to the stock price. But essentially, the sellers had no ability in Reggie to close the deal. right? During the first seller meeting, they just were not going for it at all. He was dressed sharp. He sounded very sharp, and he had done his homework on the company, of course, but they just were not buying it. They couldn't believe that he would be able to close the deal. And so, funny enough, they told him, hey, you're a young guy. We believe that, you have potential, essentially. And I'll tell you what, if anybody else decides to place an offer on his company, we'll let you know so that you have an opportunity to counter offer. Anytime someone says, I'll tell you what, you got to be careful. And so what happens? A week later, somebody else acquires the company. It was another buyer that presented a very similar offer to what Reggie presented. And so you can already see very early on the credibility problem, right? Where people were just not accustomed to black men buying companies, right? Or just black people in general buying companies. But of course, he didn't let it stop him. He kept trying until he ended up becoming the Reginald Lewis that we all know now, that was able to acquire a $1 billion company. So isn't that crazy that a guy who really couldn't acquire a business for $3 million because of a credibility problem, right? Later, right, 10 years later, was the first African-American guy to acquire a $1 billion company, from a $3 million deal, not being able to close a $3 million deal, to a $1 billion company in a decade. And so it just shows that, if you keep working and if you keep trying, of course, Reggie was a brilliant guy. You got to give it to him. But of course, with tenacity and perseverance, you can really accomplish virtually anything. So 2 years later, he's at a tennis match. So he loved playing tennis, and he's introduced to a broker. And the broker, whose name was Paul, essentially asked Reggie, I've heard that you have this capacity to raise capital. What kind of deals are you looking for? Right? So of course, brokers, they get paid when they help a buyer buy a company from a seller. The seller gives them usually 10 to 15% of the actual asking price. Now, of course, depending on the size of the company, this changes, right? Because you're not going to get 10% of a $1 billion transaction. But typically, it's 10 to 15% for companies that are small to medium size. So Reggie gives the broker his buy box. He says low tech, high cash flow, and good management, right? So these three things are still very valid today, right? A lot of people, right, if you think about the wealth transfer that's happening and everyone that's kind of rushing to buy these businesses that were owned by baby boomers that are all looking to retire now, most of those guys are looking at offline businesses, right? So car washes are super popular, laundromats are super popular, even like home service businesses like landscaping businesses are popular too. And so these three things still apply. That's literally what Cody Sanchez teaches, the millions of people that follow her now at this point. And so it's crazy that 40 years in the past, this was the same exact buy box that Reggie was, looking at. And so the broker is happy, right? Because he sees an opportunity where he believes this, that Reggie is credible, that he has the capacity to raise capital. He immediately presents him a deal, right? And this becomes where this is really what leads into Reggie putting in a bid to acquire Almat. So Almat was a company that manufactured aluminum beach chairs and umbrellas, right? So this is 1977. The gross revenue was $12 million. They were doing about $1 million in profit. And they had $3 million in cash on their balance sheet at the end of the previous year. So that was really something that was attractive, right? And so the purchase price was $7 million. And the way Reggie Lewis structured the deal, he was only putting up $200,000 that him and his brother were coming up with. Now, $5 million in bank financing and $2 million in unsubordinated, or $2 million in subordinated debt. That was the capital stack. And subordinated debt is basically unsecured financing, typically. And so that $5 million bank loan was really the first position on the deal. So everything was going according to plan. Reggie worked on this deal for almost 2 years, and he really covered the bases, right? Deal making 101. you have to build rapport with the seller. So he really took time. He was sending birthday cards. He was sending gifts. He even helped the seller. He helped the seller's daughter get a job. So he really did everything he could to lobby the sellers himself, so that, you know, there wouldn't be another issue where he thought he wasn't credible. So the plan was simple. Reggie would acquire the company and remain the chairman, while the former president and CEO would stay on and keep operating the company, right? So Reggie wanted to focus on strategy on a high level and potentially growing that business through other acquisitions, right? And so for him to be able to do that, he needed the previous seller, you know, who was also the president and CEO, to stay on. He needed him to stay on and operate the business, right? And so once again, everything was going according to plan until literally on closing day, the guy decides he does not want to work for a black guy, basically, right? And so the guy's a CEO and president, and he has some shares in the company. But most importantly, Reggie Lewis, he needed him in order to acquire the company, right? It would be a totally different deal if Reggie now had to acquire the business himself or find somebody else, right? This guy had been running the company for the past 15 plus years. So, you know, even the bank financing, right, was contingent upon, you know, this employment agreement that the guy now wouldn't sign. Now, here's the kicker. The contract of sale had already been signed, right? So this guy technically could not back out of the deal. And he really underestimated Reggie, because on the day of closing, he went as far as to say, you know, not only am I not signing this employment agreement, but I'm just refusing to work for a guy that tried to pay me under the table, which Reggie never tried to do. And so, of course, Reggie's furious. He's like, this guy is basically slandering my name, and he's like, I'm going to sue you for every penny that you got. Once again, underestimating Reggie, who's a Harvard-educated lawyer. So, of course, Reggie turns up the heat, right? Because remember, this is almost 2 years worth of expenses now from investment bankers, from attorneys, from accountants. So he has to get his expenses at least covered, right? And so he ends up getting a settlement of $250,000 just to drop the libel lawsuit. And also he gets all his expenses covered and a breakup fee because the contract of sale had already been signed, right? And so his investors even went on to say that even when Reggie loses, he wins, because he actually made quite a decent amount of money on that deal, you know, with the settlement. That being said, you know, he was really eager to acquire a company. You know, to him, this was the highest level of business, and he wanted to get off the sidelines because he had been closing all these deals as an attorney, helping people buy companies. So he's seeing all these people do what he also wants to do, right? And so after this deal now closing, you know, considering he put all this work, he was so emotionally attached. I mean, he went as far as helping the seller's daughter get a job, right? So he really was expecting this deal to close, and it was really tough for his ego, right? And he also he went into a period of depression. He even states in his autobiography, but he didn't quit. You know, he didn't quit, and that's really where his character started showing, because he just had a different type of tenacity. I mean, at this point, this is now his second deal, right? That just failed, and he did everything right. Technically, the seller just literally decided he didn't want to work for a black guy and his brother, right? So a lot of people would have given up by now, but he decided he was gonna keep at it. But first, he would start by restoring his self-confidence, right? And so he instinctively went back to focusing on his law practice. Within 6 months, they were doing $100K a month in profit, right? So he basically just channeled all of that frustration into his law practice, into doing what he knows best, which is practicing law, at least at the time, all right? You could argue that his best ability was just deal making in general, right? And so after that, he decided to take inventory of everyone that helped him during that transaction, right? So he went down the list, and literally everybody from accountants to lawyers to bankers, anyone that played a part in the transaction, including himself, right? And he graded everybody to see also what he could learn from all of this, right? And so with all of this reflection, he really realized something. Many of your strengths can become weaknesses at different stages of a deal, right? And so he realized that he had been wearing a lot of hats, too many hats. He was a deal finder, he was the chief financial analyst, he was the legal officer, he was the chief strategist, right? And he would be the chairman post-acquisition. So he was wearing way too many hats, and this approach got him really close, but it couldn't get the job done ultimately, right? He also realized that he had to take emotion out of this, right? He had to remain as logical and objective as possible, because passion was great to get a project started, and any of you that have basically either already acquired or tried to acquire a company, you know that you get extremely excited and passionate about a deal, especially as you get to talk to the seller and you get to see, how much the seller has been bringing home, and you get to build rapport with the seller, and you get to think about all the things you will do post-acquisition. You put a lot of time into closing a deal, right? It's a serious investment, not just in terms of all of the fees that can add up, but the emotional attachment. And he realized that, he had to remain as objective as possible, right? Take race out of it, take emotion out of it, no matter what. It was just another deal. Easy in hindsight to say after you've closed multiple, but of course, when you're hungry as he was, when you're as hungry as he was to close your first deal, on your own, it's really tough when you miss out on a deal. Another thing he also reflected upon was that part-time deal making was not a thing, right? This is the 80s. This is the golden age of corporate buyouts. People are in this full-time, right? They're looking to acquire companies. They're looking to break them up and sell them, and they're making millions, if not hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars, right? This is not something you do part-time, right? And so he realized that he really, although he would focus on his law practice to get his confidence back, to, make money as well, that, he wanted to be a full-time deal maker. It wasn't going to be a part-time thing. He wasn't giving up. He was here to stay. And lastly, forget about the good old boys network, quote unquote. That's what he said. He was like, these transactions, they're fueled by incentives, specifically economic incentives. So deal finders, investment bankers, the investment banks themselves, attorneys, they all were performing because of fees. Remember, this is once again the 80s. Corporate takeovers, leveraged buyouts, hundreds of $1 million. Some investment bankers later in the book were quoted as taking $500 million in fees in a single year, right? So people were operating based off incentives, specifically, financial incentives, right? People were trying to make money, right? And so it wasn't necessarily about having a great network. It was just about putting a deal together that incentivized the right people with enough money, and they will do what needed to be done, whether it was the investment banks, right? They will do what needed to be done to get the deal closed as long as they were properly incentivized. And so this gave him hope, right? So essentially, he took himself completely out of this situation, right? And it was almost like a third person just observing this and realized that, there was hope. It wasn't a race thing. He just had to put proper teams together, incentivize the right people, right, that were already closing deals, and they would get the deal done, right? He didn't want to do it himself anymore. It wasn't going to be able to work, right? Before although it was a strength of him being able to, be Harvard educated, being able to understand the financial side of things, being able to understand the legal side of things, being able to understand the overall strategy, he needed to have teams now. He needed to have people doing the right things, and he would focus mainly on just strategy, right? And this was a huge shift that really ended up helping him in all of the deals that were to come later. So he kept running his law practice, and he even moved the offices to 99 Wall Street, right? Which I kind of reflected on that too, and that screams, I'm here to stay, because this is Wall Street. And although this was his law practice, of course, Wall Street is where all of the deals really happen, right? All of the high-level financiers typically are on Wall Street or are having meetings or, dealing with just Wall Street bankers in general. And so it screams, I'm here, I'm to be treated with respect, and, I'm not coming through the back door. If I have to kick the door down, I'm coming in this building. And to me, this signifies, the building is just deals in general, right? I'm going to acquire companies. Also, I'm not just going to sit on the sidelines, right? At least that's what I got from it. And so eventually, Reggie acquired a radio station in St. Thomas. And, this was his first successful deal, but unfortunately, shortly after closing, he realized that it was just a money pit. Revenue wasn't even covering expenses. I mean, this was a station based in St. Thomas in a mountainous area, so apparently even the reception was bad. So it was just it wasn't a good deal, and he had to sell the company later. But he didn't let that stop him, right? He had at least now closed on his first deal, which it seemed like, to him, he just really wanted to get that first deal done, right? He really just wanted to be able to say, I finally acquired a company. And although that wasn't necessarily a success, he kept at it. And so in 1983, he was introduced to an investment banker, Phyllis Slice. So she was actually working for Bear Stearns, right? And she was representing a client that was trying to sell 6 radio stations, right? So they were introduced because, Reggie had bought the St. Thomas radio station, right? And his goal was actually to build a network of Caribbean radio stations and build up significant ad revenue, right? And so for him, the 6 radio stations made sense because he wanted to build a network. That was his initial goal in the first place. So in this particular deal with the 6 radio stations, they wanted to sell for about $3 million, and he was gonna have to come up with 1.5 of that $3 million. Now, Phyllis, the banker, she thought that he was pretty impressive, and she believed that he could raise the capital. But the managed company that owned the radio stations, they had really no faith in him, right? They just ended up shutting the deal down. They were not impressed at all, and they decided that he wasn't good for the 1.5. And on top of that, if he even somehow acquired it, that he wasn't good enough to successfully manage the companies, right? And so that deal fell through in July of 1983. Once again, this is now deal number 4 at this point, right? This is quite a few deals here that have failed. And so it doesn't stop him though. He's thinking go big or go home. So most people would have definitely quit by now. Like this is really tough. And remember, this is a lot of work to do these deals. These are physical prospectuses that they're going through. It's not like you go online, like now you can sign up to a newsletter like DTC Exits and get deals in your inbox. You literally have to go sift through books, like mini booklets that were the physical prospectuses, right? So it was a lot of work, and it was frustrating. It had to have been frustrating to be trying to close deals from 1975 till now it's 1983, right? So almost a decade. And so this is 1983 now. The July 1983, the radio station deal falls through, but now it's August 1983, so a month later, and this Phyllis Slice is still around, right? Reggie Lewis calls this investment banker from Bear Stearns, and he's like, I have an interesting situation. Come to my office at 99 Wall Street. The interesting situation was the McCall Pattern Company. 113-year-old sewing patterns company with gross revenues of almost $60 million. The valuation was about $23 million, so that's what they were asking for. And remember, he had just failed at a $3 million acquisition of the radio stations, right? And so now he's going after a deal that's almost 10 times bigger than the deal he just failed. And so that's what I meant by go big or go home. His reaction to failure was actually trying a deal that was even way bigger, which is, once again, it's a testament to just who he was, his personality, and his ability to just fight through adversity. McCall is still around today, right? Its parent company, CSS Industries, is a publicly traded company that also acquired Simplicity Creative Group in 2017. So that was McCall's biggest competitor, which Reggie actually thought about acquiring. But back in the 80s, he couldn't do it because he was told that it would violate antitrust laws, right? So the FTC would have had a field day with them, which was true. Because even in 2000, a similar merger between McCall and Simplicity was attempted, but the FTC shut it down immediately. So what changed 17 years later? Well, the home sewing industry has shrunk a lot, right? How many people do you know that actually sew patterns? Not many people, right? And simply in the 70s even, so even before Reggie Lewis acquired it, they already knew that the industry had a market that was slowly shrinking, right? For him, it didn't matter much because he still saw strong cash flow, and he wasn't gonna be in that business forever, technically, right? It was just a means to an end. But by now, 40 years later, that industry has shrunk a lot. But that's not the only thing, right? That's not the only reason. The distribution channels that these sewing companies use, whether it's McCall, whether it's Simplicity, they're called the Big Four. There's two other ones as well. But the distribution channels that they use are also shrinking, right? Because retail stores have been closing down their actual locations, right? So now it's mainly Walmart and maybe one other retail company where you can buy most of these patterns, right? Aside from the direct-to-consumer channel, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the most important factor really why this merger was probably allowed in 2017 is that there's tough competition now from independent direct-to-consumer sewing pattern designers, right? So these designers back in the day, they would have just licensed their designs to the Big Four, right? McCall, Simplicity, Folk, Butterick. But with the rise of the internet, they realized we can build our own audience and just go direct to consumer. We don't have to license our work. We don't have to go through these legacy companies, right? And so the legacy brands, they're not stupid, right? I mean, McCall has been around for 100+ years. They also went direct to consumer, right? So McCall is still around to this day because they were merged with Simplicity. All of their patterns are available on Simplicity's e-commerce website, right? But, many of the newer independent direct-to-consumer designers are growing faster than the legacy companies, and they're just naturally better at building connections directly with their customers online, right? And so it really just shows how much the internet has impacted just how we do business in the past 20 years, because these independent designers that are now so competitive that they've gotten enough market share to where the Big Four companies, right, are all now owned by one parent company, which would have been basically impossible to do back in the 80s, right, because they just controlled the entire market. It would have been, violating antitrust laws. Well, these independent designers now that, rose with the internet, they were not even a factor in the 80s, right? So when Reggie acquired the company, yeah, the market was shrinking, but, independent designers, using the internet to sell directly to customers and taking on market share wasn't even a factor, right? And so once again, just a testament to how fast things can change and how powerful the direct-to-consumer model is when, companies and creators, designers in this case, are able to build their own relationships directly with their customers. And so really wanted to give that background because, the McCall Pattern Company is now a direct-to-consumer company as well, right? You can buy their patterns on their website. They're still around to this day. And, it's crazy, once again, that back in the 80s, DTC wasn't even a thing. And Reggie Lewis was able to acquire this company without leveraging any of his own money and then sell it for a 90x return, right? Crazy. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into how Reggie was able to take this company, which is now a direct-to-consumer company, acquire it back in the 80s, and, through wonderful financial engineering, but also sharp management, right? He led it to their most profitable years in history. How he was able to get himself and his investors a 90x returns. So this was a prime example of financial engineering meeting actual good management of professional businesses. So a lot of private equity guys were good in terms of deal making, deal structuring, and just financial engineering, but did not really add any value to the companies that they acquired. Reggie Lewis was good at understanding the financial aspect of things and deal making and how to raise capital and get a return on that capital, but he also understood how to legitimately add value to the actual companies he acquired, right? And so that's really what made this deal so successful. So an example of some of the financial engineering that went on behind the scenes, Reggie Lewis made a genius play, right? A sale leaseback of one of the real estate buildings that the McCall Pattern Company had under ownership, right? So This building had debt attached to it, and he sold the building to himself. So he created another company that bought the building from the McCall Pattern company. And what that did is it brought a bunch of cash to the balance sheet of the McCall Pattern company, and it also got rid of debt. And so the balance sheet was a lot stronger. It left the business just in a much stronger position with that cash, right? Now, the crazy thing is that since he owned the company that bought the building from the McCall Pattern company, when they would make lease payments, right, to the new company, that was going to him. So now he was making a nice salary, a handsome salary from this sale-leaseback, right? Now, shortly after that, he also did a bond offering, right? And so they sold bonds. So the company basically sold bonds, and it was just a way for them to just raise debt again. But this time they raised more debt than needed, right? So originally they raised that debt to acquire the business. Essentially, it's almost like they refinanced that debt, and he raised a little bit more than what he needed. Now, remember, he just improved the company. He improved the balance sheet. There's more cash on the balance sheet. The profits are actually higher. So he was able to basically borrow money now that he had more equity in the company. And he borrowed that money at a higher valuation, paid off the original debt, and had cash left over that was basically debt-free because it was a loan. Shortly after that, he announced a dividend, and he paid the shareholders a handsome dividend. Now remember, he owned about 85% of the company or so at this point. So, you know, he made himself a lot of money in this period of time, but was actually also improving the actual company itself, right? He then considered taking the company public, but he couldn't do that because of the overall markets at that time. The IPO markets were just not hot, and he wanted a price per share of about $13, $14, but because the IPO markets had bottomed out and were not hot, he would have not been able to IPO at anything more than $7 or $8, right? So he went against the IPO route. So really the next best move he had was just to sell the company, right? So at this point, he had already made a good amount of money, a good amount of return. We're talking about between the sale leaseback, between the dividends that he's been pulling out of the company, he had made between $20 to $30 million already at this point. Remember, he did not use any of his own cash to actually buy this company. So this is the crazy part. And so the final chess move here was just selling the company. And because he had improved the balance sheet, because he had improved the profitability, it was coming off of its best years ever in business, right? In terms of profitability, he was able to sell it at a much higher valuation, right? So he sold it for $60 million to a conglomerate, a British conglomerate, right? That was also in the textiles business. So all this financial engineering, all this improvement, this value added, and ultimately this exit brought a 90x return to the original $1 million that he raised to buy this company, right? The $1 million that he raised independently. Of course, there was some bank financing involved, but the equity injection was that $1 million, and the return on that was $90 million for him and his shareholders, right? So this was crazy. It was a beautiful deal. It got a lot of attention in the news, but really more importantly, he left the company off better than it was before he actually bought the company, which is really where I think Reggie Lewis really stands out, right? It's not necessarily just that he was a black man, right? He actually did not like being labeled as the first black guy to do anything. To him, he was just another businessman that was great at what he did, and it just so happened that he was black, right? And so, once again, crazy deal, masterful lesson here. So many things to learn from this. But once again, a 90x return on equity. And if we really sit back and think about it for a second, technically, it's an infinite return because he used $0 out of his own pocket. So for him, it was actually what people call an infinite return, right? And so, once again, just a testament to what is possible when you are buying established companies that have strong cash flow. And then when you just learn the actual deal-making part of it and how to actually add value to these companies, the sky really is the limit. And so, although after the McCall Pattern company, he got, a lot more recognition. Of course, the credibility thing was not really a factor anymore. He went on to do an even much bigger deal, Beatrice Foods, which had 60 plus companies in 30 plus countries, right? It was a crazy conglomerate. But the crazy part of this is that the McCall Pattern company, in his own words, was his best deal. So he was even more proud of the McCall Pattern company just because of how masterful it was and just the incredible return. And I think that for us as well, if we look at it from this point of view, McCall Pattern company deal is very impressive because unlike the Beatrice deal, he had no credibility prior to this, right? So the Beatrice Foods deal, which was $1 billion company, we can argue that, is really out of sight and out of reach, right, for the average businessman, right, who may not have a Wall Street pedigree, right? But for the McCall Pattern company deal, which really he only had to come up with $1 million, right? Now, I know I say $1 million, which may sound like a lot, but once again, you have to remember the cash flow that this company was bringing in was almost $20 million in the past 2.5 years, right? So $1 million to raise is really not that much compared to the amount of cash this company could bring, especially when we look at the fact that later he made $90 million from that deal, right? And so once again, the McCall Pattern company is so impressive because it's not something that's necessarily out of reach. He didn't use any of his own money. He had really only one deal that successfully closed before the McCall Pattern company, but that deal failed too. That wasn't even a successful deal. He didn't get a good return on that deal, right? So really we can't argue that it was his pedigree or relationships or network that made that deal go through. That was just pure skill, right? Pure effort and pure determination. So with all that, we're wrapping up the first episode of the DTC Exits pod. We'll talk a little bit more about Reggie Lewis in the future videos. Of course, we'll cover the Beatrice deal, but I'm really curious to know what you guys thought about this deal, what you guys learned from this. Personally, I learned so much. For example, one of the things I really take away from this is you can't quit and you can't stop, right? And I know that might sound a little bit cheesy, but seriously, like, this guy kept missing out on deals, kept being told he had no credibility, kept being told, who are you? How are you going to get this deal closed? And he only went after bigger deals. And so the McCall Pattern company deal was actually the biggest deal that he had even attempted at the time. And that's the deal that actually worked for him. So all that to say, just because you have minor setbacks, which may seem like, the world is ending, it doesn't mean you should stop. In fact, it means you should probably think even bigger. And so that's really what I took from this McCall Pattern company deal. And I'll see you in the next video. Make sure you like, you comment, you subscribe if you enjoyed this. Once again, I'll see you in the next video.